Imagine an 8-year-old child waking up in the middle of the night to the desperate cries of their mother. The child gets up, walks to the parents' bedroom, and finds the woman who should be their protector completely shattered, unable to function. Without hesitation, this child takes control of the situation, calming the mother, preparing tea, organizing the medication, and even managing to soothe the younger sibling. At just 8 years old, this child has already learned that being strong is not a choice, it is a matter of survival. This shocking scene is not fiction. It is the reality of millions of children around the world who have been forced to grow up too soon. And the most disturbing part? Most people around these children praise them for their maturity and responsibility, never realizing the devastating price they are paying. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to have been born adults? Why certain children display an unsettling sense of responsibility, while others of the same age can barely tie their own shoes? The answer lies in a devastating psychological phenomenon called parentification, a process that robs children of their childhood and creates adults who appear functional on the outside but are deeply wounded inside. Parentification occurs when a child is forced to take on emotional, practical, or psychological responsibilities that should belong to adults. It is as if the world of childhood were brutally interrupted, catapulting the child into a role their mind and heart are not yet prepared to play. But here is the first mystery we will unravel throughout this journey. Why don't these children completely collapse under such impossible pressure? The answer lies in a primitive and powerful defense mechanism that the child's brain develops. When a child realizes that their emotional or physical survival depends on their ability to care for others, something extraordinary and terrible happens at the same time. The brain literally restructures itself, creating new neural pathways that prioritize hypervigilance, problem anticipation, and the suppression of their own needs. These children become little emotional detectives, able to read microexpressions, detect changes in tone of voice, and predict conflicts before they even erupt. They develop an early emotional intelligence that impresses adults, but this ability comes at a brutal cost: the complete loss of spontaneity, lightness, and the simple ability to just be a child. The second mystery we must understand is even more disturbing. Why does society reinforce this behavior instead of recognizing the problem? When we see a 10-year-old child perfectly taking care of younger siblings, organizing the house, and consoling their parents, our instinctive reaction is admiration. What a mature child! How responsible! What an example for others! But no one asks, where is this girl's childhood? What did she lose to become so perfect? Parentification creates a cruel illusion of competence. On the outside, these children appear exceptionally successful. They get excellent grades, help at home, never cause trouble, and receive praise from everyone. But inside, a silent battle takes place every day. They learn that their worth as a person is directly tied to their ability to solve others' problems and keep everyone around them happy and functional. The third mystery we will explore is perhaps the most complex. How does a child manage to function in a constant state of alertness without completely collapsing? The answer is emotional dissociation. These children unconsciously learn to disconnect from their own emotions and needs. It is as if they create an adult version of themselves that operates on autopilot, while the real child remains locked away deep in the mind, waiting for someone to finally see and protect them. This dissociation allows them to function, but it also creates a permanent sense of emptiness and disconnection from themselves. They become strangers in their own bodies, experienced at caring for everyone except themselves. And here is the cruelest twist: the more competent they become at solving others' problems, the more invisible their own needs become. The fourth and final mystery of this first part is the most devastating. Why do these children often feel guilty when someone finally tries to take care of them? The answer lies in the deep programming they received. They were conditioned to believe that receiving care is selfish, that having needs is weakness, and that their only way of ensuring love is by being useful. When someone tries to reverse this dynamic and offer genuine care, these children's internal alarm goes off. They feel uncomfortable, unworthy, and often reject the help, preferring to return to the familiar role of caregiver. It is a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle that will profoundly shape their future relationships. If you are recognizing patterns in your own life or in the life of someone close to you as you follow this analysis, make sure to subscribe to the channel to follow the full unfolding of this psychological journey. What you will discover in the next parts could literally transform your understanding of yourself and others. Parentification does not end in childhood. It creates a model of functioning that the child will carry into adulthood, shaping every relationship, every professional decision, and every moment of intimacy. And the scariest part? Most people who went through this process don't even recognize what happened to them, continuing to live trapped in patterns established decades earlier. Now that we understand how a child develops this armor of premature responsibility, we need to dive into the darkest part of this story, how this programming manifests in adult life and why it is so difficult to break. The first answer to our initial mystery lies in neuroscience. When a child lives in a constant state of alertness, their brain literally rebuilds itself. The amygdala, responsible for detecting threats, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-control and planning, develops prematurely. It is as if the brain created an ultra-sensitive emotional radar system that never switches off. The result? Adults who can instinctively detect when someone is sad, irritated, or in need of help, even before the person themselves realizes it. They become masters at anticipating others' needs, but completely blind to their own. This emotional hypersensitivity turns them into magnets for dysfunctional relationships, always attracting people who need to be saved or fixed. But here is the first devastating twist. This extraordinary ability to care for others does not come from love, but from fear. Deep in their minds lies a primitive terror of abandonment. They unconsciously learned that being useful is the only guaranteed way not to be discarded. That's why, even when exhausted, they keep saying yes, keep taking on responsibilities that are not theirs, keep being everyone's safe harbor, except their own. The second answer to our mysteries reveals something even more disturbing. Remember how these children were praised for their maturity? That positive reinforcement created a toxic association between personal worth and performance. In adulthood, this manifests as a compulsive need to be perfect, productive, and indispensable. They became addicted to the validation that comes from being the strong one, the problem solver, the one who never falls apart. The problem is that this identity is a prison. When you build your entire self-esteem on being strong and solving others' problems, what happens in the moments when you need help? What happens when you are vulnerable, confused, or simply tired? The answer is brutal. You feel like a fraud, an imposter failing at your only purpose for existing. Here is where we discover why these people reject care when it is offered. Receiving help completely contradicts the internal programming that says, I exist to care, not to be cared for. When someone tries to reverse the roles, their inner alarm goes off with a clear message, danger. If I am not useful, I will be abandoned. The third layer of this psychological mystery is even more complex. These people develop what we call toxic hyperindependence. They pride themselves on never needing anyone, on being able to solve everything alone, on being self-sufficient in every way. But this independence is not strength, it is a wound disguised as a superpower. Hyperindependence is born from the deep wound of having learned that trusting others is dangerous. After all, it was precisely the people who should have cared for them who failed them first. So they built an emotional fortress where no one can enter, where they control everything, and where they will never again be disappointed by someone they trusted. But living this way exacts a devastating emotional toll. Behind this facade of absolute control is a child screaming inside, when will someone take care of me? When can I stop being strong? When can I simply rest? The fourth answer to our mysteries reveals the cruelest trap of all. These people become masters at creating relationships where they are always the saviors, never the saved. They unconsciously choose romantic partners, friends, and even jobs where they can maintain the familiar role of the one who solves everything. It is as if they are addicted to the drama of being indispensable. Here comes the second emotional twist of this journey. When they finally meet someone who genuinely wants to take care of them, they sabotage the relationship. They cannot tolerate the vulnerability that comes with being truly seen and loved. They prefer the familiar pain of being useful but invisible to the terrifying unknown of being loved for who they are, not for what they do. This sabotage is not conscious. It is a primitive protection mechanism whispering, if I don't truly open up, I can't be truly rejected. So they maintain an emotional distance even in their closest relationships, always keeping a part of themselves guarded, always ready to return to the safe role of caregiver. The result is a deeply lonely existence, even when surrounded by people. They have dozens of acquaintances who depend on them, but no true friend who really knows them. They have relationships where they are adored for their ability to solve problems, but they never experience the real intimacy of being accepted in their moments of weakness. And perhaps the most devastating aspect is this: they have become strangers to themselves. They have spent so much time focused on others' emotions and needs that they have completely lost touch with their own desires, dreams, and boundaries. If you ask one of these people what they truly want in life, they will be genuinely confused. The question sounds almost absurd to someone who has been programmed to exist only for others. But the story does not end here. There is a way back home, a path to reconnect with the lost child and finally learn to live in an authentic and fulfilling way. And that brings us to the most crucial moment of this psychological journey. The most devastating moment in the life of a parentified person happens when they finally realize the truth. They were never truly strong. They were only a terrified child doing the impossible to survive. And this discovery does not come as relief. It comes as an emotional collapse that shakes the very foundations of their identity. Imagine discovering that your entire personality, all the praise you received, all the admiration you earned was built on top of a wound. It is like discovering that the house you lived in your whole life was built on quicksand. Everything you believed about yourself crumbles at once. This is the moment of awakening, and it is rarely gentle. It usually happens during a crisis, burnout, depression, the end of a relationship, or simply the accumulated weight of decades pretending to be someone you never were. Suddenly, the mask of competence falls, and the person comes face to face with the scared child who always existed behind the adult facade. The most shocking revelation at this moment is discovering that the strength everyone admired was actually a desperate survival mechanism. There was no choice, no heroism. There was only a child doing what needed to be done, not to be abandoned. And now, decades later, that same child is exhausted from carrying a burden that was never theirs to bear. But here is the cruelest twist of this journey. When these people finally recognize their pain, when they admit they need help, the world around them often abandons them. The very same people who benefited from their constant strength disappear when it is no longer available to solve others' problems. It is as if they only had value while they were useful, and now that they need care, their usefulness is over. This secondary betrayal is often more painful than the original trauma. Discovering that their relationships were conditional, that people loved them only for their function, not for who they were, is a blow that can completely destroy their faith in humanity. It is at this moment that many parentified people shut down for good, concluding that it is better to be alone than to be used. Here we find the answer to the deepest mystery of all. Why is it so difficult for these people to accept genuine love? Because they learned that love is always conditional, always based on performance. They never experienced love simply for existing, love that remains even when they are not being useful, love that accepts them in their weakest and most vulnerable moments. The process of reconnecting with the inner child is brutally painful because it involves grief. They must mourn the childhood they never had, the protection they never received, the moments of lightness that were stolen. They must grieve for all the years they pretended to be adults when they were still just scared children trying to survive. But here is where the true magic happens. When a parentified person finally allows their inner child to be seen, when they stop hiding them behind competence and control, something extraordinary is revealed. That child is not dead. They have been waiting patiently, sometimes for decades, for someone to finally recognize and embrace them. The inner child carries all the dreams that were abandoned, all the spontaneity that was suppressed, all the joy that was sacrificed. They still know how to play, still know how to take pleasure in small things, still have access to a creativity and vitality that the hyper-responsible adult had completely lost. The most moving moment of this journey happens when the person learns for the first time how to be their own mother or father. When they finally turn inward all that extraordinary capacity for care they always offered to others. When they learn to speak to themselves with the same gentleness they always showed everyone else. This process is neither linear nor easy. There are constant relapses, moments when the old programming tries to take control again. The temptation to return to the familiar patterns of hyper-responsibility is constant, especially when crises arise around them. It is as if the inner child is always testing. Will you abandon me again when things get hard? But something miraculous happens when the person persists in this process of self-care. They begin to attract completely different relationships. People who value them for who they are, not for what they do. People who want to know their vulnerability, not just their strength. People who offer reciprocity instead of just taking. The most surprising discovery in this process is that caring authentically for oneself does not make them selfish. It makes them more genuinely generous. When their own needs are met, when their inner child feels safe and loved, they can offer others a completely different kind of care. A care that comes from abundance, not from lack. A care that expects nothing in return because they are already whole. This is the moment when they realize they can choose when, how, and to whom to offer their energy. That they can say no without feeling guilty. that they can receive care without feeling unworthy, that they can have needs without feeling selfish, that they can rest without feeling useless. The parentified person finally learns the difference between being strong because they want to and being strong because they must. They discover that true strength does not come from never needing anyone, but from knowing when to ask for help. It does not come from solving every problem, but from knowing which problems are truly theirs to solve. And perhaps the most liberating discovery is this: they do not need to carry the world on their shoulders to have value. They always had value, from the very first day, simply for existing. The child who was forced to grow up too soon can finally come home. The healing journey of a parentified person does not end with the recognition of the wound, it only begins there. What comes next is a process of reconstruction that requires the courage to completely dismantle an identity built on false foundations and to create a new version of oneself, this time based on authenticity instead of survival. The first step of this reconstruction is perhaps the scariest: learning to establish healthy boundaries. For someone who spent their whole life saying yes to everything and everyone, the word no becomes completely unfamiliar territory. It is like learning a new language after decades of speaking only one. The first no's come out shaky, full of guilt, followed by an avalanche of desperate justifications. But something extraordinary happens when a parentified person speaks their first true no. They discover that the world does not collapse. People do not die. The relationships that were genuine remain, and those that depended on their constant availability naturally drift away, revealing their true transactional nature. This process of setting boundaries is like learning to breathe for the first time. Each no creates a new space, a place where they can exist without being at someone's service. Each boundary established is an act of self-love that communicates to the world and to themselves: I have value independent of my usefulness. The second phase of healing involves reconnecting with bodily sensations that were suppressed for decades. Parentified people often live disconnected from their bodies, operating purely on the mental and emotional level to care for others. They lost touch with basic signals like hunger, fatigue, tension, or physical pleasure. Relearning to feel one's own body is like returning to live in a house that was abandoned for years. There are dusty corners, unfamiliar sensations, and a certain initial strangeness. But gradually, they rediscover that they have physical preferences, that their body communicates legitimate needs, and that ignoring these signals is not virtue, it is self-abandonment. The third crucial aspect of this journey is developing a new relationship with vulnerability. The parentified person needs to learn that showing weakness is not dangerous, that asking for help is not failure, and that being imperfect does not make them unworthy of love. This is perhaps the hardest lesson, because it contradicts decades of programming that equated vulnerability with abandonment. But when they finally allow themselves to be seen in their imperfection, when they share their struggles and fears without immediately trying to solve or minimize them, something magical happens. They discover that authentic vulnerability does not push the right people away, it draws them closer. They discover that real connection happens not when we are perfect, but when we are genuinely human. The fourth dimension of healing involves relearning what it means to receive. For someone programmed only to give, accepting care, gifts, help, or even compliments becomes a monumental challenge. The initial instinct is always to immediately reciprocate, to turn any gesture of care into a transaction where they quickly restore balance by giving back. Learning to receive without instantly reciprocating is like learning to breathe underwater. It feels impossible at first, but gradually they discover that the world does not demand payment for every gesture of kindness they receive. That sometimes people simply want to give because they take joy in caring, not because they expect something in return. The most transformative moment of this journey happens when they finally find their own voice, not the voice they learned to use to calm others, to resolve conflicts, or to be useful, but their authentic voice. The one that expresses their true feelings, desires, and opinions without first filtering them through what would be most convenient for others to hear. This voice may have been silenced for so long that at first it comes out as a hesitant whisper. But the more they use it, the stronger it becomes. And with it comes a surprising discovery: they have unique perspectives, valuable insights, and genuine contributions that do not depend on solving others' problems or keeping the peace. The deepest phase of healing happens when they learn to reparent their inner child consistently. This means creating self-care routines that do not depend on being in crisis, establishing comforting rituals that nurture their soul, and developing a gentle inner dialogue that replaces years of relentless self-criticism. Reparenting oneself involves asking the questions no one ever asked: what do you need today? How are you feeling? What would bring joy to your life? What would you like to do just because? These are simple questions that become revolutionary for someone who was never taught to see their own needs as legitimate. The end result of this journey is not the elimination of the ability to care for others, it is the transformation of the quality of that care. When their own needs are met, when their inner child feels safe and loved, they can offer others a completely different kind of presence. A care that comes from choice, not compulsion. A support that is offered because they want to, not because they need to be needed. This healed version of the parentified person becomes a powerful example of how it is possible to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, independent and connected, generous and with healthy boundaries. They discover they can maintain their extraordinary sensitivity to others' emotions while developing an even greater sensitivity to their own needs. The most powerful lesson of this journey is that healing does not happen by suppressing or fixing the traits that developed during parentification. Emotional sensitivity, the ability to read situations, the natural skill of supporting others, all of these are genuine gifts that can be preserved and honored within a healthy context. The difference is that now they operate from abundance instead of scarcity, from self-love instead of fear of abandonment, from conscious choice instead of unconscious compulsion. They become a person who cares because they want to, not because they must. Who is strong because they choose to be, not because they have no alternative. And perhaps the most liberating discovery is this. The child who is forced to grow up too fast not only can return home, they can create the home they always deserve to have. An inner place of safety, acceptance, and unconditional love that no one can take away, because they finally learned how to give it to themselves. If this journey touched something in you, if you recognized familiar patterns or awakened memories of your own childhood, consider subscribing to the channel to continue exploring themes that can deeply transform your relationship with yourself and with others. Healing is possible, and you deserve to experience the freedom of being authentically you.